Thank you for joining us for this CNBC Africa debate focusing on leadership for agricultural transformation, coming to you from the 52nd African Development Bank meetings taking place in Ahmedabad, India. Joining me for the conversation, I have Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank. We are joined by His Excellency Macky, Sall, President of Senegal, and we're joined by Ambassador Kenneth, Quinn, President of the World Food Prize Organization. Before we go any further, there are a couple of stats that we need to really observe from an agriculture perspective. And those are the stats that you have heard repeatedly in the sessions that you've attended to this point. Firstly, Africa imports $35 billion of food on an annual basis. And this is set to increase to $100 billion if the situation is not reversed by 2030. 58 million children under the age of 5 living in Africa suffer from malnutrition. Now Africa has 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land. We need to move from the vision of Africa feeding itself to the reality of Africa feeding itself. And as President Adesina was saying in his keynote address earlier today, that distance between vision and reality is action, and it's action from leadership that is required. So President Adesina, without any further ado, could we take a step back for the audience that has tuned in across the African continent? We've got viewers from across 48 different countries in Africa. Perhaps you could take a step back and highlight the emphasis of the Feed Africa strategy, which is the second high five of the African Development Bank. Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks very much. Let me say that there couldn't be anything more important to discuss than the issue of how to feed Africa, because in a world in which you have to industrialize, you have to industrialize with what you have, not with what you don't have. And agriculture is what Africa has. And as you rightly said, you've got 65% of the arable land yet uncultivated in the world, not in Asia, not in Latin America, it's not in Europe, it's not in the United States, it's in Africa. And so what Africa does with food, with agriculture, is going to determine the future of food in the world. And so the first thing I think that we've got to really do with agriculture is to change the mindset on agriculture. I think agriculture is not a social sector. Agriculture is not a development activity. Agriculture is a big money-making business. My goodness, if we are spending $35 billion a year importing something, that will rise to $110 billion a year by 2025 if we don't do anything. That tells you that we're spending our hard-earned foreign exchange as countries, importing what we should be producing, and we are actually decimating our rural areas. And so at the African Development Bank, we believe that to help economies to stabilize in terms of macroeconomic stability and fiscal stability, we've got to really take agriculture as prime. And that's why the African Development Bank is going to be investing $24 billion in the Feed Africa strategy for Africa. And what exactly are we talking about? First is to make sure Africa feeds itself. We're right here in India. India fed itself. The second is how to make agriculture, in terms of industrialization, adding value to everything that we produce. And third, very important, is also to make sure that Africa is competitive in things that it exports. How can we be exporting cocoa beans and be stuck at the bottom of the value chains while others are making money on chocolates? What's the brain surgery in making chocolates? I remember when I went to Belgium, I went into a store and I saw them, they have been making chocolates since 1863. And I was asked the question, how do you like our store? And I said, well, your store is good, but you've been making chocolates since 1863. It tells me that Africa has been doing a stupid thing since 1863, because Africa should be processing cocoa, processing coffee, processing tea, taking its cotton, taking it into textile and garment. And so at the African Development Bank, we think the time has come for agriculture to be taken as a business that will allow Africa to unlock massive amount of wealth, and that's why we are putting so much money behind agriculture today.
Ambassador, let me bring you in at this point, and we appreciate the fact that you're taking the time to spend with us on this session, given the very important World Food Prize Foundation and the fact that you award a prize to an individual that manages to impact the quality, the quantity, or the availability of food worldwide. Africa, you must be eyeing as a very important point in the equation of food security globally, given that stat that we're going to refer to over and over again, that we have 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Is Africa central to your discussions?
Africa is absolutely central to the World Food Prize, which was founded by Dr. Norman Borlaug, the man who runs through all of this, who came to India when it faced massive starvation, hundreds of millions at risk of famine and death, and going to the government, brought his new seeds from Mexico, and the Green Revolution was born. And Dr. Borlaug, in 1986, came to Africa for the first time. Same year, Mr. President, I came to Africa and visited your country with the Secretary of State. And Dr. Borlaug's passion was to bring the Green Revolution to Africa. And he, in 2006, at the Fertilizer Summit in Abuja, where President Adesina was organizer and making it all happen. And so Borlaug's passion is what I'm carrying forward. In 2000, when I retired after being ambassador to Cambodia and took over the World Food Prize in Des Moines, Iowa, we had 0 laureates from Africa and 0 women laureates. I'm so proud to tell you we now have 6 women, not nearly enough, and 5 laureates from Africa. We've inspiring African science, Dr. Monty Jones, Gabisa Ijeda, African leadership in President Kufuor, and African biofortification and nutrition with Maria Andrade from Cape Verde, Robert Mwanga from Uganda. And I came, it's a long way from Des Moines to Ahmedabad, but I came, 1, because President Adesina invited me, 2, because I knew Norman Borlaug wanted me to be here, but I came to say the World Food Prize, our $250,000 prize, is there to inspire and honor and reward those breakthrough accomplishments that need to happen, and I'm convinced will happen, Africa to meet the great challenge of feeding an additional billion people in the next 30 years.
Precisely. By 2050, the African population is expected to explode to that 2 billion level. President Adesina, let's come back to infrastructure and to energy provision. Now, if you speak to agriculturists across the African continent, they will say to you that 2 of their biggest challenges are lack of energy and lack of infrastructure to get their goods to market. It's no mistake that the first high 5 is light up and power Africa. We still haven't shifted the needle. There are still 600 million people in Africa without access to electricity. Can you talk to me about the changes that we're starting to see, the execution in the provision specifically of energy and energy infrastructure?
Thanks very much. I want to say that the critical thing to do is you can't industrialize if you have no power. You can't do anything in the dark anyway. And that's why the African Development Bank decided that our first priority has to be to light up and power Africa. You heard today from the Prime Minister of India, how much he set a target that by next year, no single Indian is not going to have access to electricity. That's the kind of push that we're going to have. Sometimes I feel that Africa is stuck at the bottom of the value chain in a part-dependent way. In a way, you don't have electricity, so what can you do? You're stuck. You can't process your cotton, you can't process your cocoa, you can't process your tea, you can't process anything. And so at the African Development Bank, as you know, you were there when we launched the Light Up and Power Africa, the World Economic Forum. We are investing $12 billion in the energy sector over the next 5 years. and we hope to mobilize or leverage about $45 to $50 billion from the private sector. What have we done since the last 1 year that you and I talked about it? First and foremost, we as a bank structure ourselves to be able to push. We created a vice presidency for power energy because without a structure, you can't deliver it. And my vice president, Ahmedabad Holt, is here, and we've hired world-class people to run that complex for us. The second thing that we've done is that last year alone, we put $1.7 billion into the electricity work, and we leveraged $2.5 billion. And we started talking to ourselves about how do you get solar pumps working for farmers? You got to use off-grid systems. And so our target is to connect 75 million households through off-grid systems, solar power systems and I see the lady there from Burkina Faso that is doing our work. But what we have done is we've set up a facility that's called Facility for Energy Inclusion in Africa, which is $500 million approved by our board of directors. This will support small and medium-sized enterprises that want to do solar PV systems but below 30 megawatts. So it allows them to have access to affordable financing. The other thing that we have done is that you're from South Africa, and you know that ESCOM provides electricity, and sometimes it doesn't work.
Sometimes it falls over, and we find ourselves in the dark.
Exactly. But we provided, through syndication, a syndicated AB loan facility of $1 billion to ESCOM to be able to do its operation. That way it can supply electricity all across. Now, the other thing that we've done in Kenya, I see the representative of President Kenyatta, who is doing a great work in Kenya with electricity. We provided financing from the bank to connect 1 million people, last mile connection in Kenya, which is transforming Kenya. And the last thing that we are going to do, which is what we call off-grid revolution, is that all across the Sahel, from Niger to Mali to Burkina Faso to Chad to Mauritania and so on, if there's anything we have in abundance, it's sunshine. I mean, God is so good to Africa. He gave us a lot of sunshine. But we are going to have to harness that. And so what we are going to be doing now is my vice president, Ahmedabad Holt, and their group is developing now a new financing model that will take the companies that are working in Kenya, like the M-Copa that is doing single solar PV systems, like the Mobisol that is based in Berlin that is actually connecting households with single solar PV systems. We want to take them to scale. We don't need 250,000 households. We need 75 million households. And so we are working right now on a new facility that will allow us to take that to scale. And I can't just tell you enough why electricity is important. Mr. President, you know the issue of security. Terrorists operate in the dark. They love dark places. And so we've got to make sure that we light up and empower Africa first for education, for health, for industrialization, but also our security depends on it.
It's the starting point. And President Sall, let's get you to elaborate on your relationship with the African Development Bank and the speed of execution that we're seeing as a result of that first high five, Light Up and Power Africa, and how Senegal is benefiting.
We have an excellent relationship with the African Development Bank, and I must congratulate the President, the entire staff and board of directors of the bank accompanying Africa in those priorities. You know, when we are partners, we should be speaking the same language. And as such, Africa's priorities should be the same as the priorities of its partners. The ADB is along these dynamics, and from Ahmedabad, where I am currently, let me make this appeal for the capacity building of the African Development Bank for recapitalization, so that African countries can take ownership, and also the non-regionals can also beef up the bank's capacity, so that our development challenges are met. With respect to energy, we do not have any ADB financing, but the ADB is providing financing for a transformational project, which is a railway project. It is actually a light rail which would be quite transformative in Senegal between Dakar and the new airport. It will actually be bimodal. using electricity and thermal with 160 kilometers per hour relative to the metric trains of 1924. So you can just gauge the progress being made. With respect to energy, I must state that we cannot achieve development without energy. In 5 years, we have achieved tremendous progress. At the time when I came to the helm of the state of Senegal, we had serious difficulties because on average, in a year, you had actually 1 month, 10 days with no electricity, 913 hours of outages because of lack of fuel, because of extremely expensive diesel generators, because of poor planning. In 5 years, we started by changing the policy. We launched the energy mix, which would reduce our sole dependence on fuel, petroleum or oil, with the plummeting or with the rising oil prices at the time. We also brought in the private sector through power purchase agreements, and as such, with diversification, we're also able to usher in solar development, and we have a reserve of 125 megawatts at peak periods. So we've addressed the issue of production with 25 to 30% of renewables over a period of 2 years. We obviously still have challenges in terms of commercial losses, and those automated and prepaid meters will help in addressing such commercial losses. We also have some effort being made in terms of transmission so that the country is interconnected, which was not the case. So in all the peripheries, we are developing microgrids with solar, with local grids, and ensure interconnection of the other regions so that we can really optimize technical yields and production and have improved management so that the subsidies which were paid in 2012, 105 billion CFA francs or $210 million. Today we have a surplus of about 35 billion CFA francs or $70 million. This is just to tell you concretely what has been done, which demonstrates that in such instrumental sectors as energy, infrastructure, agriculture, we are making progress. And with respect to agriculture, it gives me pleasure to tell you that with respect to groundnuts, over a period of 4 years, we became a groundnut exporter, and we have more than 1 million tons of groundnuts being produced thanks to the productivity I referred to. We are on the right track. Of course, efforts are still to be made to enhance the financing of the agricultural sector, to strengthen the capacity of women in terms of agricultural financing, because they need financing. And in this respect, we have actually launched the African Union Initiative for Affirmative Action for Women in Agriculture.
President Adesina at this point and use the example of Côte d'Ivoire, where the African Development Bank is headquartered. Now, in 2011, that economy contracted by 4.5% in a post-election crisis. Fast forward to 2012, and with the right policies, the economy grew by 9.8% in 2012. 2013, it grew by 8.9%, and now sustainably, it's around about that 8% level. So Côte d'Ivoire is the fastest growing economy in West Africa. And the point that I want to make here is that the Living Standards Index, according to the World Bank, in 2011 saw the poverty levels in Côte d'Ivoire sitting at 51%. As a result of that increased and fast-paced economic growth, that poverty level was reduced to 46% by 2015. Now, that's a reduction of 5%. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that economic growth does lead to poverty reduction. It is inclusive. Perhaps you would just like to elaborate on that example of Côte d'Ivoire, the miracle, the economic miracle of Africa, as it is often referred to.
No, I think you're right. If you look at the economic growth rate, GDP growth rate of Côte d'Ivoire, it's actually right now about 8.3, 8.4%. And it's not just the highest in West Africa. It's probably one of the very highest in the world. And Africa doesn't tell its great stories, and sometimes we always realize others give us the wrong narratives. You've got 12 countries that are growing at above 5%. 20 countries that are growing at 3 to 5%. In the world wherein everybody's head is underwater in the global economy. So I just think that that's great. Look at Senegal. Mr. President is here. Senegal is growing at 6.7%. And they're doing a great job with regard to that. But to come back to the issue of how to ensure that this kind of growth goes faster and that we can actually reduce the level of poverty, I think we need to take agriculture, back to the agriculture story, more seriously. You take China. China was able to get 400 million people out of poverty in 10 years by trying its agriculture. You take India here, as the president of the World Food Prize said, the prime minister of India at the time, India was dependent on food aid from the United States, which is called PL 480 program, dependent on wheat. And then at the time, the debate was, will India be forced to sign a nuclear non-proliferation treaty with Pakistan? And the prime minister said, absolutely not, we are not going to do that. And they said, well, we're going to have to cut off your food aid supply. And the prime minister said, okay, then we produce our food. So what needs to be done? And the chairman of the World Food Prize, Professor M.S. Swaminathan, great Indian scientist, walked to the prime minister and said, we can get this job done. And within 3 years, this same country became not only self-sufficient, but it moved itself to become a powerhouse in food. So the point I want to make is that to drive millions of people out of poverty, political will matters. And that the other thing that matters is commitment to pace of change. We cannot get people out of poverty incrementally. If you are stuck in a well and you're trying to get out of the well, you can either scratch your way out of that well and you keep falling back every time. But if I put a crane in that well, I can lift so many people up at the same time. That's what inclusive growth does. And so when we take agriculture in the rural areas, if we transform that, we would transform all of Africa's rural areas from zones of economic misery today to zones of economic prosperity. And one way that I argue that we should do that, back to your point on infrastructure, is to set up what we call staple crop processing zones or agro-allied industrial zones, just like you have special economic zones in China. You put in power, you put in roads, you put in ICT infrastructure, and water. Now, when you do that, you reduce the cost of doing business by private sector food processing companies, who are all sitting right now in the cities, close to the ports, and they are bringing in raw materials. So they will relocate themselves into those zones and process and add value to everything we produce. So you create markets, you reduce post-harvest losses, you process food that you sell in the urban areas. The ministers of finance will like it because they can get a lot of taxes from the rural areas. But I think that the point is we will be faster in getting hundreds of millions of Africans out of poverty by totally changing our rural space.
So, President Adesina, let me test that idea with the ambassador. In terms of the availability of food and quantity and quality, agro-processing zones, as is being tabled now by President Adesina, is that potentially the silver bullet?
I think absolutely it is. And what I would observe is, what's very interesting, the African Development Bank has had wonderful leadership in the past, but now it has a leader who comes from agriculture and integrating agriculture into the bank's plan, looking at Africa as a whole. I worked in Asia I worked on China, on its development beginning in 1979. Xi Jinping, the president, came to Iowa, my home state where we are, when he was a young man. I took Xi Jinping's father around Iowa, and I watched them transform their economy from being 60% of people in poverty. 13 years later, the Minister of Agriculture of China got off the plane in Des Moines to receive the World Food Prize. They lifted 500 million people out of poverty. I believe Africa can do the same. I believe this is the way. It's clear that you have to have infrastructure to get the food from the smallholder, where they grow it, process it, the infrastructure, the value chain to move it. Dr. Borlaug loved roads. They were key. He told young students, if you don't have a road, there's no reason to grow the food. You can't get it to the people who need it. I was in the villages in 1967. You know I don't look that old, but I'm going to be 75 on Friday. Yes. And so I was in the villages at the same time Norman Borlaug was doing this, and I saw the transformation with the new miracle rice, miracle wheat, miracle sorghum, and the roads to get it to the farmers. Without the roads, the farmers never used it. That's why this integrated plan, processing zones, they will work. That is what's going to transform Africa, because the smallholders here have to be made into business people. They have to produce a surplus. And they can do that with, like Nerica that Monty Jones developed. They can do that with innovative entrepreneurs and with processing zones, with things that will link the cities with the farmer. That's what we're looking to inspire with our World Food Prize. We also have a prize for young people under 40. We've given it 5 times, 3 times to individuals working in Africa. Find somebody under 40 that you're working with, nominate them, closes June 30th, worldfoodprize.org, and we can together inspire those breakthroughs that are going to allow Africa to fulfill the vision that President Adesina outlined this morning in his opening remarks.
Ambassador, you bring us to a very important point, and it is one that has been stressed by President Adesina, and that is Africa's youth and their role in the agriculture story for the African continent. We need to understand, and Mr. President, let me come to you at this point, what Senegal is doing specifically to encourage the theme, and it was touched on in a session yesterday, Africa's agriculture is cool. So talk to me about empowering your youth and how that can transform agriculture.
Well, the youth in Senegal, I always draw a parallel to Africa, because Senegal we have 75% of the population with under 35 years of age. So it means that it's a very young country. So if you pick up under 25-year-olds, it's about 55%. So it have the growth rate for youth, it's around 2.7. Of course, we need a higher growth rate to keep the balance and to create wealth. But what is basic is to give to youth training and education at schools, but also vocational training. It's the new challenge. It's the new paradigm that we have started in the training system. So after the colonial period, in the independence, we started in training staff that we really needed. So in fact, we wanted to train doctors, we trained lawyers, jurists, and we forgot the technicians needed for development, we forgot that we had to give training to farmers, to those operators for the machinery for farmers and for plumbers. So universities, in fact, had all that it takes to have doctorates, but in fact the needs of the economy were not fulfilled. So we are about to progressively change the paradigm of training to, one hand, provide general education and practical teaching to enable youth to have a better access to the employment market. And at the same time, we have created citizenship, and in fact the employment is under the Ministry of Youth to create this dynamic of giving employment to youth. In the agricultural sector, for instance, we have two major programs. One is called the Community Agricultural Program at local level. We try to have 2,000 hectares and to have 2,000 to 3,000 young people which will settle in these areas where they live, so they receive their training. Some of them don't have training, so we provide them training in the farming techniques, and so that it can have revenues around 150,000 francs, so around $300 per month. So it enables to keep them in their own lands instead of going into immigration. So this is on the agricultural sector. So we have the cattle raising, we have also the tree, and also the agriculture. So we have the fisheries. So we have the 40 to 50 hectares. So from 5 to 40 hectares. So the small family farms, we provide support to these families and to help them get revenues. So it's the 40 hectares to 100 to 150 youth. So we make them grow potatoes, tomatoes, and also dealing with the water systems for the irrigation. So we really try to have these incubators for the agriculture, but also in other sectors such as the new technologies in ICTs, information and communication technologies. So this program for us leaders is to give some good perspectives for the youth, and we work with the African Development Bank and together with them for the youth employment.
Mr. President, I'm going to get President Adesina to come in here on the youth element, and this is a program that you started. So when you were Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, how are the youth responding? Are you getting the response that you want?
Well, I think we are. I think agriculture is the coolest thing you ever found. You know, when I was minister in Nigeria, you know, I used to wear my bow ties all the time, and because I wanted the young people to understand that you can do agriculture and still be cool, right? And, you know, I've got Ida Osakwe that's here. She was my senior investor advisor in agribusiness. And we got a lot of young people doing youth employment and agriculture program, DG, Okogu, everybody here that used to be in government at the time. And I'm excited today to look at the following. I see doctors going into agriculture. I see engineers, I see architects. I see them bankers. I see people in the oil and gas industry who have suddenly woken up to realize what I've been saying, that nobody drinks oil and nobody smokes gas, but everybody eats food. To realize that the biggest market is it's agriculture. And this is big money. Let's just look at the numbers. By 2030, the size of the food and agriculture agribusiness in Africa will reach $1 trillion. $1 trillion. So if you're thinking of how to make money, that's the sector to be. The president was talking about it in terms of processing, producing food, processing food, you know, logistics and transport, marketing food, you know, services for those that are in agriculture. It's really fantastic. There's a young man who was on a panel yesterday, Aroge, who, you know, got, I think, almost $480,000 from the Bank of Industry in Nigeria. You know, he's a medical doctor. I don't know if he's here, but I can tell you he's not using his stethoscope. Oh, that's him over there. Yeah, he's not using his stethoscope anymore. He's using different types of equipment.
And there's a great work going on in Nigeria by the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, IITA, which is called, they're getting all these young people that are doing amazing things. One of them is a guy called Noel, who's from Bukavu area in in Congo, DRC. This guy takes cassava, processes cassava into high-quality cassava flour, and they use it to substitute in making bread in DRC. He makes $4,000 a week doing that. Now, he told us that he's going to move to $10,000 a week. In their zone where they are, Katanga area where they are, they've been able to reduce the amount of import of wheat by about almost 28% just doing that. What I'm trying to say is that the opportunities are immense for young people. But as the president said, a number of things have to be done. We have to provide them access to finance. If you're a young person, you walk into a bank and you're 21 years old, they ask you, where are your tax receipts for the last 40 years? They don't understand the issue. And so for us at the African Development Bank, we've launched a great program that's called Enable Youth Program, which is last year alone, we provided $800 million to 8 countries to create in each country 10,000 young agribusiness entrepreneurs that are graduates. We want people that are going to be like the Aliko Dangotes of food in Africa. And what we are trying to do in that program is reduce the risk of lending to them, bank on the youth people, the young people. They are the future. And as I said, when it comes to agriculture, how many of you eat cornflakes? Right? Everybody eats cornflakes for breakfast, right? But what's the big deal on cornflakes? Cornflakes is simply corn that is extruded, in which you add a little bit of sugar and some vitamins. And that is how Kellogg became a billionaire. And so every time you're eating cornflakes, you're making Kellogg family even richer. And so just to tell you that this is a very critical area that we must do. The president mentioned on that point, access to land. He's absolutely right. Giving them access to land is very important. And ICT, our young people are doing amazing things with ICT today. I see them in Rwanda, in Kenya, providing services in the agriculture sector, whether index information to farmers, extension information to farmers with ICT.
So President Adesina, I want to talk about ICT, but I just want to clarify one thing. Yeah. The Enable program. Yes. The key to accessing that $800 million is to have no history, straight out of grad school. Well, you're going to be held to this answer.
Well, let me tell you that you can't just come out and grab money. So the way it works is that the program allows you to get technical training, so you know about how to do agriculture. But it gives you a program to allow you to develop your businesses. And then we provide financing to reduce the risk of lending by commercial banks to them. So 70% of all of our financing goes to de-risking the commercial banking sector to lend more to the young people. And I want the bankers that are in this room to listen to me and listen to me very well. Because the biggest mistake that was done in business globally was when Bill Gates developed his software, Microsoft, and he went to IBM and he said, I see a big future for the laptop. And they said, well, pay him about $85,000 and great ideas, but there's no future for the laptops. We only need big mainframe. It's the worst business decision ever made in history. So when you see those young people walk through your door, trust them. They have passion. They have commitment. They have ideas. These are the people that you should support, because if we don't change the labor composition of the agricultural sector, in the next 20 years, there will be no farmers left in Africa. And these young farmers now don't want to be called farmers. They want to be called agripreneurs. It's a cool thing to be.
It's a cool term, an agripreneur.
So support agripreneurs, all the bankers that are here. If we can get a deal on that, I'll be the happiest person.
President Sall, I'm coming back to you now. President Adesina mentions ICT and technology. Now, there are, gentlemen, for the next 15 minutes, we still need to talk about the gender gap and what is being done for women. We also need to touch on intra-Africa trade and the potential that could have on Africa's agricultural landscape. But I still want to focus on technology because, as Strive Masiyiwa said, as part of the Africa Progress panel and the founder of Econet Wireless, 2 decades ago, 70% of the African population had never seen a mobile phone. Today, 70% of the African population has a mobile phone. So on that premise, what can technology do for agriculture, the leapfrogging term that we talk about? Is it possible? Is it happening in Senegal? And then, Ambassador, I'm going to get you to add your thoughts.
Merci.
Senegal, in fact, in ICTs, is always follow this great development. We have almost 60%, 70% of the mobile phone for the population. So, in fact, there is an average of the people in Senegal who have 2 or 3 mobile phones. But it's quite impressive that currently we have portable mobile phones, smartphones. It's not just intellectuals and the high officials, but also the tradesmen, women who have their small shops. They can have their own iPad or Samsung to take pictures and exchange via their WhatsApp and to place their order. So this is the reality we're living in Africa. So the adaptation has been quite easy. Africa didn't need to recover the industrial delay to be at the same level as the world in terms of the fourth revolution in communication technologies. We keep on providing training to young people and to make access to the net to be a very easy access and cheap. Unfortunately, telephone and internet is quite expensive, and we have a couple of initiatives within of Smart Africa within the African Union, so that amongst the African countries we could have international networks, how do you call it, roaming. And East Africa has achieved this, and West Africa is trying to do the same to facilitate the access and to make it more accessible. And Senegal, in university campus, we have a free access to Wi-Fi.
Ambassador, perhaps you can add to that by giving us a sense of the people that are entering for the World Food Prize. A lot of those innovations that you see must be driven by the very technology that we're speaking about, which comes back to that leapfrogging issue.
Well, absolutely. Technology is the key. It's what's developed in the laboratories by the plant scientists who now can change a plant that would take Norman Borlaug 20 years to change. They can change it in months or a year. And how that information is shared or not is one of the key issues. Norman Borlaug stressed till his dying day the importance of public research, of having research that is allowed to be shared. That's how he developed his miracle wheat. And one way of sharing it, of course, is by open data that's available on the internet. I want to say in terms of youth, I run a youth program, and women, young women, are the key to transforming agriculture. 2/3 of all the participants in our youth program are young women. I saw young women from the cities excited in Uganda by the issues. And you don't have to just be in farming. You can be in biotechnology, in social science, in gender equity, in finance, in building cooperatives. And young women, the countries that make full use of young women are the ones that are going to be successful, whether it's Africa, Asia, wherever.
President Adesina, let's add, because beyond Enable, which is your program for the African Development Bank targeting the youth, you also have an affirmative action financing program targeting specifically women. And of course, we understand that women are at the heart of the agricultural equation across the African continent.
No, absolutely. I just want to make one quick comment on the issue of the technology. I think that today we have mobile phones, as Mr. President said, and we are using that to be able to deliver access to fertilizers and seeds massively all across African continent today.
That started when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria. We used that system called electronic wallet system to deliver subsidized farm inputs to farmers over their mobile phones. And we reached 15 million farmers over 4 years. And today, the African Development Bank is taking that model, and we are working with many, many countries. We're going to go to 30 countries to help them to do that. We've started that in Liberia. We've started that in Benin. We've started that with Kenya and several other countries. And as we speak, that same approach is being borrowed by Afghanistan. We're using it now in Afghanistan to be able to supply inputs. The point is, as Prime Minister Modi said in his remarks this morning, is that technology is so key. We can deliver technology, agricultural technologies, information, market information, insurance, nutritional information, you name it, all over the mobile phones today. So we've got to realize the most important tool in the hand of a farmer is the mobile phone. And I want to really applaud what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing in this particular area of digital financial inclusion, because we are working with them, and they have a great program right here in India, which is called Digital Green, that allows farmers to have access to information through the mobile technology. But coming back to the issue of women, let me make it personal for me, because I really believe that if we're talking about sending girls to school, if you're talking about really having inclusive growth on the continent, we can't achieve that unless we do something big about women. Now, we all talk a lot about women, but at the end of the day, talk doesn't get the job done. What we need to do is to provide massive financing facilities for women. The president was talking about the fact that women form the bulk of the farmers in Africa, but I can tell you they find it very difficult to get access to financing. That's why at the African Development Bank, we've decided to launch what we call the Affirmative Finance Action for Women, which basically means that we are going to bank on women farmers and agribusinesses in Africa and other SMEs that they have in Africa. When we unlock that, we will provide guarantees for banks and financial institutions to de-risk their lending to women. Women, 97% of them pay back their loans. I'm not going to ask the men what they do with theirs. So that just alone tells you you should believe in women. You should bank on women, and we trust that in the African Development Bank. And as I said this morning, when you look at birds, I like bird watching, but I've never seen a bird that flies with one wing. I see birds that fly with two wings. Africa, the faster Africa gets women equality done, the fastest we are going to really get the inclusive growth that we're looking for. Just to end on that, I'll tell you one quick thing about women and agriculture. One of my students, a PhD student, who worked with me in 1990, Pascal Senginga. He did his PhD with me on looking at the impact of technology of soybeans in northern Nigeria. And he did a survey, and this woman said to him, he said, first and foremost, I must let you know that soybean is what I use to send my kids to school. With soybean, I bought myself nice dresses. Soybean, I built my house. Soybean, my kids are well. He said, soybean is my husband. What else do you need in a husband? And so it just tells you that when you empower women, you empower households. You want to deal with malnutrition, empower women. You want to get girls in school, empower women. And that's why I want the finance ministers that are in this room today to please work with the African Development Bank on how we will de-risk lending by banks and financial institutions to women. I can give you the guarantee they will pay it back. Banking on women is the best thing that we can do, and that's why we are doing the affirmative finance for work in Africa.
President Sall, I know you have to be excused, sir, but before you go, I do just want to get your sense on climate change and sustainable farming and the fact that we have not inherited the earth from our parents, but we have, in fact, borrowed the earth from our children. Just that comment, sir, and then we'll excuse you from the panel. Thank you.
Now, with regard to sustainable agriculture, Africa, as we know, without being a major polluter of the world, because our contribution is less than 4% of CO2 emissions, but we are still the country that really bears the brunt of this, climate change. Now, I referred earlier on to control over water, also mastery over crops, because we have droughts and we have also floods. So we need also to look into the varieties that are more adapted to these conditions. That's why I'd like to say that the Africans have done their contributions. The promise was 9 million euros in order to support this nutrition sector. I believe that there must be support by the international community in this regard. And also we need to make sure that Africa is further present in rural areas, because the population in rural areas is the most vulnerable, and they really need to benefit from support, not only from the state, but also from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I wanted to come back to the issue of climate change and get your sense in terms of the World Food Prize, how important that sustainability of the environment is when it comes to the judging process. Ambassador.
Oh, sustainability and dealing with climate is absolutely vital. We gave our prize in 2013 to the 3 pioneers of biotechnology, genetic modification. We know most controversial subject in all of agriculture, biotechnology, genetic modification. But here's the bottom line. For the smallholder farmer struggling to sustain herself in Africa and other parts of the world, increasing heat, drought, floods, rising seas, saltwater intrusion, she needs every asset, every tool she possibly can have. And biotechnology provides another asset, and she should at least have the choice of using that. So it's key to what we do.
And then finally, President Adesina, we need to touch on intra-Africa trade, and along with the agro-processing zones, that this potentially could transform Africa. Your thoughts, sir? How do we drop those barriers to the free movement of goods, services, and people? I see you've started with your own passport at the opening ceremony this morning.
I was just going to start with that, actually, that if you can't move, you can't trade. I read something about Aliko Dangote, who is Africa's richest man, who says he has to get 38 visas to be able to visit in African countries. If your richest man can't get around, how do you make progress? But I'm delighted the African Development Bank supports the Africa Visa Openness Index. We've seen a lot of improvement in African countries in making it easier for people to travel. But as far as I'm concerned, the key for Africa to being able to reduce the volatility that it is subject to in terms of volatility of commodity prices is for Africa to build a wider market. And so the Continental Free Trade Area that the African Union is pushing for, it's time for it. Because the evidence shows that the countries that trade more within the regions are less susceptible to volatility in commodity prices. So that's one. The second thing that we at the African Development Bank believe strongly in is to connect Africa together. We are investing in roads, in rail, in ports, and so on, that are all very critical for regional integration. But at the end of the day as well, we're also investing in soft infrastructure for single border posts to be able to move things back and forth. Now, if Africa can just increase the share of trade, right now it's sitting at about 15%. You look at Europe, it's probably about almost 64% and so on. We've got to be able to trade a lot among ourselves. And so one of the areas in which we are interested going forward is the idea of working on these corridors, these huge corridors, like you take the Nakala corridor, for example, or the Northern corridor. These corridors are areas that we are investing a lot in because it makes it easier to move goods and services all across. You know, if there's anything that I want to say to African leaders is that bring down the walls, bring down all the walls. Africa should be one real integrated market, vibrant market. We must be able to feel at home in every part of Africa. Nations are where you're born. That's where you're born. but Africa is where you belong to. So we must be able to move around and invest freely all across this continent.
If we go back to that opening stat that Africa has 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land, then it certainly is the vision that Africa could be the breadbasket of the world. And coming back to President Adesina's statements, that to move from the vision to the reality, you need action. And let's celebrate the action that we're seeing from the African Development Bank when it comes to forcing, to moving, to speeding up the structural change within Africa's agricultural landscape. Thank you so much for joining us for this debate, coming to you from Ahmedabad, India, where the 52nd African Development Bank annual meeting is currently in session. Thank you.